If you have an idea for a level that will require some extra room, dynamic thermometer levels are the answer. A dynamic thermometer level allows you to stretch far beyond the usual space limitations. But there are some things to keep in mind to keep things running smoothly. Take a look now in your global stuff. You can change a level into a dynamic thermometer level from the gameplay controls page. Just tweak dynamic thermometer level to yes. Immediately, you'll notice that you have loads more space to build your level in. A dynamic thermometer level works by only loading certain parts of your level at a time. Every dynamic thermometer level has a loading zone, which is an invisible box that follows the players throughout the level. Once a piece of your level is in the loading zone, it will load in, and your players can see and interact with it. When a piece of the level isn't in the loading zone anymore, it will load out, removing it from the level until it's needed again. You can change the shape of the loading zone in the dynamic thermometer level tweaks. This will help ensure your level is loading in the right pieces at the right time. If your level is very wide, for example, a wide loading zone will load pieces to the left and the right of your players without worrying too much about what's above and below them. This will make your level run more smoothly. Similarly, you can also change the loading zone size. If your level is tightly packed full of complex workings, a smaller loading zone will make sure your level isn't trying to load too much at once. But if your level has a lot of wide open spaces, a larger loading zone will prevent players from getting to areas before they load in. It's important to realize that even if something is outside the loading zone, it will remain loaded in if it's attached to something inside the loading zone. Keep your dynamic thermometer levels organized into separate chunks to keep them running nicely. There are other tools to assist in keeping your dynamic thermometer levels working correctly too, but we'll get to those in other tutorials. Sometimes, when you're working on a dynamic thermometer level, you need to make sure something stays loaded in at all times. That's when you call upon the Permanency tweaker. It's found on the Tools page of your Tools bag. When you place a Permanency tweaker onto an object, it will never load out, no matter how far away from it your players go. This is really handy for stuff like global logic, but be careful. Using too many permanency tweakers in one level will cause too many things to load in at once. This will make your level slow and sluggish, and nobody wants that. When you're working in a dynamic thermometer level, there will sometimes be occasions when you want to be sure two things will always load in at the same time. For example, if you have a platform for sackbots to walk on, but the sackbots load before the platform, they'll just fall into space. If you seem to be having issues like this, the loading linker will sort it right out. It's on the Tools page of your Tools bag. While in a dynamic thermometer level, just select the loading linker. Notice how everything on screen becomes outlined in a certain color? Everything of a certain color is in the same loading group. Things in the same loading group will always load in together. To place two things in the same loading group, just hover the loading linker over one object and press the action button. Then do the same with the second object. See? Now they're the same color. It's as simple as that. Just be sure you don't link too many things together to ensure your level runs properly. The Preloader is an advanced tool for managing your dynamic thermometer levels. It allows you to use logic or player positioning to tell the game to load an area in your level that it wouldn't otherwise be loading. It's on the Tools page of your Tools bag, so take one out and take a peek at its tweak menu. The Place Zone option lets you shape a box around the area of your level that the Preloader will load. Anything inside the box will be loaded in when the Preloader activates. Change it the same way you change a camera zone or an emitter zone, and once you've set it up, just press the action button. Next, check out the Load Type tweak. You have two options, Preload and Full Load. If the zone is preloaded, it's not quite in the game yet, but it's in the queue and ready to go once the players get there. This is helpful when you need the game to know where your players are going, but you don't want it to devote all its resources to loading the area quite yet. Conversely, a full load does it all. The area is fully loaded right then and there. This can be useful, but always be mindful of not telling a dynamic thermometer level to load too much at once. If your preloader is going to be triggered by player proximity, set up the trigger zone in the trigger category, and change whether it requires all players in the behavior category. You can ignore these tweaks if your preloader is triggered by logic instead. Finally, you may have noticed that the preloader has an output. This will start giving a signal once the preloader has loaded its designated area so that you can delay logic until the area is ready to go. In dynamic thermometer levels, there are two types of loading zones. First, there's the loading zone around the player. Second, there's the loading zones created by the objects and logic in the level. Dynamic thermometer levels work by following this simple rule. When the player's loading zone intersects with the loading zone of an object, the object gets loaded in. It's important to know when and how loading zones get created and what determines their shape and size. Let's show you how the shapes and sizes of object loading zones are determined and how this affects your dynamic thermometer. Every object in your level has its own invisible loading zone in the shape of a rectangular box around it. When you connect multiple objects together by gluing, they will be considered one object and share a loading zone in the form of a square box around all the glued objects. A similar thing happens when you connect two objects together using a connector or a logic wire. Sensors that have a radius also affect the size and shape of the loading zone they belong to. The loading zone will be a rectangle around the maximum radius. Additionally, you can create your own loading zone around multiple objects by using the Loading Linker tool. Simply select the loading linker from the dynamic thermometer section of the Tools bag and tap the action button on multiple objects to group them together in a loading zone. When you are finished selecting the objects, press the Cancel button to create your new loading zone. If you want an object to be permanently loaded in, you can use the Permanency Tweaker tool. To use the Permanency Tweaker, grab one from the dynamic thermometer section of your tools bag and place it on an object. That object and all objects in the same loading zone will now always be loaded in. The dynamic thermometer gives you lots of extra room in your level. Unfortunately, it doesn't give you infinite thermometer. To ensure your level runs smoothly, it is very important that you do not have lots and lots of things being loaded at once. The best way to do this is to carefully manage your loading zones. We'll go over some tips and tricks to help you manage your loading zones, allowing you to increase performance on your dynamic thermometer levels. As a general rule, you want your loading zones to be as compact as possible. There are a couple of things you can do to achieve this. When creating in a dynamic thermometer level, you will want to avoid gluing things as much as possible. Larger objects like floors and platforms are especially best left unglued. They can often create large loading zones and cause unnecessary stuff to stream in. Instead, make objects either static or use the anti-gravity tweaker to keep things in place. Another thing you want to pay special attention to when creating a dynamic thermometer level is the radii of your sensors. As the radius of a sensor gets larger, so does its loading zone. In dynamic thermometer levels, you should always try to shrink down the radius of your sensor as much as possible. Additionally, you can also tweak the trigger angle range to shrink down the loading zone even further. One of the biggest troublemakers in dynamic thermometer levels are long logic wires. Remember, connecting two objects or logic pieces with a wire will put them in the same loading zone. If the objects are far apart from each other, this loading zone will be very large and cause many things to load in when it's not needed. Here, the button on the bottom left of our level is connected with a wire to a teleporter on the top right of our level. Because the resulting loading zone has the shape of a large rectangle around all the objects in the zone, the loading zone will include the area in the center. This means that when the player is in the center, both the bottom left and top right area of the level will get loaded into our streaming zone. As Sackboy is nowhere near these areas, loading these parts of the level while Sackboy is in the center is a waste of resources. This can possibly affect the performance of the level. It's best to prevent this kind of setup whenever possible, so we will delete the wire causing the issue. As you can see, unplugging the wire removed a large loading zone and left us with 3 nice compact zones. So how do we get the signal from the button to the teleporter without creating a huge loading zone? Remember, using a normal tag sensor to transmit the signal wirelessly would create a very large radius, which also creates a large loading zone. This is why we will use the remote tag sensor. Because this sensor does not have a radius, it does not create a loading zone in the same way as a normal sensor would. First, plug the button into a tag. Then grab a remote tag sensor from the sensor section of the tools bag and hook it up to the teleporter. Now comes the tricky part. If we press the button, nothing happens. This is because the remote tag sensor is not loaded in while we are in this section of the level. The solution here is to use a preloader to make sure that the remote tag sensor is loaded in when we are about to press the button. Grab a preloader from your tools bag and place it near the button. Now, open its tweak menu. Select Place Zone and move the box over to the teleporter area. Set it to full load and tweak the maximum detection range so it covers the button. You also want to make sure it has a correct layer range. By doing this, the destination area and remote tag sensor load in your level whenever a player is close to the button. This makes the area ready for someone to teleport to. As you can see, the teleporter works again. Plus, we still have our 3 separate loading zones. Now you can be in the center without the rest of the level loading in. Use this technique whenever you can to replace long wires. Your dynamic thermometer levels will run even better. If you ever want to know exactly what is being loaded in a certain area, you can use the Lock Dynamic Loading option from the Start menu. When you enable this, all dynamic loading will pause, and you can fly around to see what is currently being loaded in. This feature can be very useful to identify areas of your level where too much stuff gets loaded in. To see how this works, let's see if this level really has separate loading zones. If we enable Lock Dynamic Loading while in the center of the level, we can see that both corners of the level are indeed not loaded in. We can also check to see if our preloader works too. Let's land near the button that teleports the player, lock dynamic loading, then check to see if the destination is indeed being loaded in. As you can see, our new setup works beautifully. Another way to gain more information about your loading zones is to zoom the camera out until you start seeing colored boxes. This view is called the Streaming Visualizer. As you fly around your level in this view, active loading zones become visible, while loading zones that are currently stored in memory will show up as red boxes. If you have set up your dynamic thermometer level correctly, only parts of the level close to Sackboy will be visible. The rest of the level should show up red. You can also combine this view with Lock Dynamic Loading to see what is currently loaded in. Areas that are currently loaded in will show up as green, like our preloaded teleporter setup. Objects that have permanency tweakers will also show up as green as well.